Hello and welcome. I'm Riz Khan. In this world, nothing can be certain except death and taxes. That was the view of the American statesman Benjamin Franklin, who fulfilled his own prophecy by dying in 1790. Well, 335 years later, are we living through the most uncertain times in history? How do you feel about risk, chance, luck, and probability? Would you like more certainty in your life? Would you like to know when you'll die, or whether or not you'll have kids? What are the chances that your favorite football team will win the cup? On this episode, we'll explore the world of uncertainty and probability, and along the way, we'll explode a few urban myths, such as, could a bunch of monkeys really write the complete works of William Shakespeare given enough time and typewriters? Yes, that needs explaining. So to help us in our quest is the renowned British statistician, Professor Sir David Spiegelhalter. He's Emeritus Professor of Statistics at Cambridge University, and his latest book has won rave reviews around the world. It's entitled The Art of Uncertainty: How to Navigate Chance, Ignorance, Risk, and Luck. And he joins me now. So it might be easy to assume that people would like to have certainty. And I guess that the question is, what sort of relationship do humans in general have with certainty and uncertainty?
Well, people claim they would like to be certain about things, but actually, if you're at all realistic, you realize you can never be certain about very much at all. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know what's going on at the moment. We often don't know what's happened in the past. And that's just part of being human. And I love digging into people with audiences. I like them. I'll ask them, well, do you want to know what you're going to get for Christmas? Do you want to know how a football match ends when it's been recorded? Do you always just jump to the last, program in a whodunit series? No, people love living with that uncertainty. I also ask people, would you like to know when you're going to die if I could tell you? And then some people do put their hands up, but not that many. Only about 1 in 20 say they'd like to plan for it. Most people just live with the fact that there's so much we don't know.
I was going to say the question itself must be quite important, because knowing when you're going to die is much deeper than, for example, what sort of present or the ending of a mystery novel.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, I can't tell them. But, I think, living with that uncertainty, not knowing we might be able to say what's going to happen in an hour or a day, even a week, a month. But if we start looking years ahead, then life's full of uncertainty. The universe, our lives go off on all these different branches, all these possible futures. And we just don't know which of those particular tracks we're going to take.
Terms such as probably, likely, lucky even are among those quite commonly used. And I wonder to what degree they're interchangeable, and do people tend to misuse them?
Well, of course, we all use words like could, perhaps, may, likely, might happen, all the time in our everyday language. And most of the time that works really well. We're just expressing the fact that we don't know. We've got a degree of ignorance. But when it becomes to important decisions, it's really dangerous to just use words because they're so easily misunderstood what these terms might mean. I mean, I take statins, and if I look at my little leaflet, I hear that constipation is a common side effect of statins. And if someone just sort of, people have done experiments, and on average, people would say, oh, that probably means about 1 in 3 people suffer from that. No, actually, it's only 2%. It's only 1 in 40. But there's a regulation that says if a percentage between 1% and 10% suffer from a side effect, it has to be called common. So, words in that area, common, that's what common is defined to mean, but that's not what common means in everyday language. So it's really important that words are defined, and words like likely have got a definition in many contexts. I've got a mug here that I got from MI5 when I gave a talk, which reports the official word language to use when you have a probability for an event. So if at MI5 or MI6 or the British intelligence services say an event is likely, it means between 55 and 75% probability. It imposes an agreed, fairly rough magnitude for what these words mean.
It's interesting there because you've moved on to what would be what we talked about, the personal kind of level, to what is a much more important one, which is global risks and strategic calculations, policy decisions that have to be made. And I guess it's a different matter when you start to think about those.
Yes, yeah. I mean, the example, famous example of what can go wrong is going back to 1961, the Bay of Pigs, the planned CIA invasion of Cuba by Cuban exiles of Castro's revolutionary Cuba. And there, when Kennedy became President Kennedy, got it after his inauguration, he found out about this. He hadn't got a clue beforehand, and he commissioned the chiefs of staff to do their own report on it. And they thought it was a pretty bad idea. In fact, they came up with a number that it was about 30 to 70 chance, 30% chance of success, 70% chance of failure. But those numbers didn't go into the report that went to Kennedy. For some reason, they got translated as a fair chance of success, which, it didn't represent their views particularly, and the invasion went ahead, not just because of this report, but, it did go ahead and was a total fiasco. And I think, people have learned from that. And so when Osama bin Laden had been thought to be in the compound at Abbottabad, and President Obama was deciding whether to send in, a squad into that compound, then he had multiple teams assess probabilities that that's where bin Laden was. And the teams came up with a variety of opinions. Some were very optimistic and said an 80% chance he's there. Others were, what you might call a red team, were rather pessimistic and thought only a 30% chance he was there. And he heard all these opinions. And in the end, he recorded as saying, I thought it was about 50-50. He went for it. And, it turned out he was there. But it seems to me that is a massive progress in two ways. First of all, getting rough probabilities on what may be the case, with that, which are judgments, of course. And secondly, and really importantly, getting multiple opinions from different teams, which go straight to the decision maker. It's been argued in some academic papers that maybe those teams should have got together and presented Obama with a single opinion. And I would argue strongly against that the actual decision maker, who actually has to take responsibility, should know when there's variability, essentially disagreement among his advisors.
That's actually very interesting, David, because what that suggests is, if they got together beforehand, they might have just concluded something that didn't give that level of risk or probability a real chance to be considered.
Yes, I mean, they might have given a probability, but they don't, in a sense, give the uncertainty about that probability, because uncertainty can arise from personal ignorance. But also, when you're an observer, when you're a decision maker, uncertainty is also driven by the variation in opinion, essentially disagreement. It changes your uncertainty, and it's his uncertainty that was important.
If governments and major organizations are now starting to perhaps dedicate some resources to looking ahead to any kind of strategic decision making, I wonder if you think NASA might, for example, have people to assess the kind of risks, or what might be involved in landing a human on Mars. Perhaps even if Elon Musk, if he gets up there, is going to actually meet a Martian.
Yeah, the first, yes. There will be risk analyses going on all the time about space. I was going to call them adventures, but projects, shall we say. People are always doing risk analysis, what's called probabilistic risk analysis, where you try to look at what might go wrong and try to put that together into some sort of statistical model and come out with some sort of rough probability of each chance of failure. And sometimes those analyses are not very good, but people have had a lot of experience of doing that. I'm not sure about the Martians. I'm not sure whether they would even bother with that.
Well, science fiction is an interesting field because it's trying to calculate and look ahead all the time. I mean, we look at what happened in Star Trek, for example, which goes back, 40, 50 years as a series. And some of the things that we see there, I guess back then we were wondering, is there a probability of this ever happening?
Yeah, I think I think Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy had a lot of, with the, guide to the Hitchhiker's Guide was just an iPad, essentially. It was extraordinary. So I think so. And, if you think of looking into the future of constructing possible scenarios. Again, that's an area where you want to have multiple teams, just using their imagination. And the Ministry of Defence in the UK employs science fiction writers to produce, sort of imaginative short stories. They're very good, in fact, they really are. And they're all publicly available with a lovely disclaimer: the Ministry of Defence does not necessarily sort of support the scenarios presented in these stories. But I think that's very imaginative, because the one thing we can guarantee is what will happen. We haven't thought of what's going to happen. It's being surprised all the time, and we should try not to be surprised. People call it sort of de-blackening, so black swans, those unexpected things that afterwards we have a good explanation for. We're not surprised by those things. So I think we could all do with some de-blackening.
When it comes to real world news, though, I'm guessing that big stories on the news agenda, illustrate the importance of uncertainty and probability calculations. And just thinking about the California fires, for example, because that's going to leave people wondering, should I remain and rebuild, or should I relocate and reduce the risk of this happening again? And I'm guessing also that, governments, insurance companies, firefighters, meteorologists, and so on, they also need to be looking ahead and figuring out the possibilities and probabilities and what might happen.
Absolutely, they're all doing that, and the biggest ones doing that, of course, are the insurance companies, because I don't know what the payout will be for the Californian fires, but they will be really extraordinary. And the absolutely huge losses coming from particularly American natural disasters have led to the development of what's called catastrophe modeling, where people build very specialist models that model the impact of things that have never happened before. They're way out in the tails of normal behavior, because they're going to happen at some point and people are going to have to pay out. And so since the development of catastrophe modeling, the insurance companies, through reinsurance, etc., have been able to deal with these huge claims. But because I can't remember, it was one particular hurricane that nearly broke them. So in a way, the technology is always slightly trying not to be one step behind. And of course, we can never, be precise about this. We can only produce some probabilities. And we're working in the tails of the distribution, as I said, which have never been observed. And yet we can still try to get some handle on them.
How much, as humans, how much can we or should we tolerate risk, and to what degree?
Oh, that's really tricky. I think you'd have to separate the personal from the societal. From a personal level, we all have our risk appetite and our degree of risk aversion. And people have shown that varies between people. And even within a person, somebody might be very sort of bold and even risk-taking physically in terms of taking part in high-risk activities, and yet be very cautious about their investments and their money and things like that. I've known people like that. So I think it's not a simple answer at the individual level. We all have our risk appetites, and we all have our level of boldness and caution. At a societal level, that's when, in a way, decisions are being made on all our behalves. And at that point, I think that, an analysis is required, but also perhaps a degree of precaution in the face of what you might call, well, essentially unknown unknowns. Rumsfeld's old idea, which I think is a extremely good summary of the situation we're in when we're facing really possibly catastrophic events. And then, because society then is building a sort of insurance for the entire society in terms of, how high to build the flood defenses, and so on, where to allow houses to be built, et cetera, what protections to put in for the whole of society. And then, because the blame that is then, if something does happen, the blame that can occur from the public means that usually there's quite a strong degree of caution built in. Take train disasters. A huge amount of money is spent to prevent train disasters. Now, I think nobody's been killed in a train accident in the UK for about 10 years, I think. They're incredibly safe to travel on a train in the UK. And yet still, if you ask the public, they'd like to spend more money on automatic braking systems and so on, which puts the sort of marginal value of saving a human life up to, absolutely stratospheric levels. And it's just not worth doing it. So at some point, society has to decide, well, we've put in enough precaution. We're not going to do any more. And actually in the UK, they decided not to institute even further safety measures on the railways because it just wasn't worth it.
I can see how the concept of risk becomes a very complicated thing. For example, you could say that someone who has a lot of money isn't taking a huge risk if they're investing a certain amount of money into a project or into a fund or something, whereas someone with less is risking far more. But it comes down to emotions too. So there are many wealthy people, for example, who wouldn't risk investing no matter how much they could afford to lose, just simply because of their emotional connection to the money or whatever their wealth or whatever it is. So I wonder how much do human emotions factor in how humans assess the risk versus reward?
A huge amount, but really this is the work of psychologists such as, Danny Kahneman with his Thinking Fast and Slow talks about this a lot. The work of Kahneman and Tversky looked at in detail sort of attitudes to risk taking, both whether it's to do with gains or losses, where you are, etc., where you start from. So show that our, human behavior and our feelings about risk and losses and gains come into the equation very strongly indeed. And it's not just a matter of rational decision making, something I think is very dubious indeed, although it's loved by economists who kind of seem to think that we all act as rational agents, which is completely nonsensical, I think, because to act as a rational agent, you have to know exactly what the possibilities are, what the values are, what the probabilities are, and so on. And we just don't know that in almost any circumstances apart from the simplest sort of gambles. And so I quite like the taking down of this idea of rational behavior because inevitably feelings come into it. But I would say that we shouldn't just be operating by our guts when it comes to decision making in the face of uncertainty, particularly not at a societal level. I want somebody not to be just working on their gut feelings when it comes to deciding how big the flood defenses should be. I want someone to do some analysis. And so I think that, Paul Slovich identified this nice idea. There's risk as analysis and risk as feeling, and they're both important, but it's not one or the other. You have to take both into account. Which is why it's such a fascinating field.
And presumably confidence and perhaps taking it further, arrogance could be a big factor in a person's willingness to take a risk.
Oh God! In my book, I think I don't use the word rational at all. I think, but the word humility comes in again and again and again. It's essentially a huge plea for humility. Admit we don't know. I mean, Rumsfeld had a way. He was great, the great sage, I consider him, with his known unknowns and his unknown unknowns. He should have talked about the unknown knowns, which I think are an interesting area, which he didn't discuss. So I think to acknowledge the limitations of our understanding is the very first step we have to take. We have to have that humility, and we should expect that humility from our great leaders. And we don't see it. I mean, politicians are absolutely hopeless at admitting their uncertainty. Maybe they just feel they have to be absolutely confident that what we're doing is the absolutely right thing. And of course, what it does is then leave them when circumstances change or they learn more, they're stuck. It happened in COVID that, they made decisions that even just a few weeks later were found to be wrong, but they couldn't change because they were stuck with them, because they couldn't admit the provisionality of what they decided. So my huge hero is this guy, John Krebs, Lord Krebs, who was head of the Food Standards Agency in the UK. And there was disaster after disaster he had to deal with, foot and mouth and mad cow and scrapie, absolute shambles. And he developed, because of that, an absolute playbook for talking to the public in these crises, and he reduced it to 5 points, which I list all the time, and I watch whether people are doing them. First thing is to say what you know, be really clear about what we're confident about, then immediately say what you don't know, or the unknowns, current things you're unknown. Then you say, what you're doing to find out, the research you're doing, the experiments you're doing to find out. Then you say what people can do in the meantime, which may be precautionary, just to be on the safe side. You might not want to buy lamb or something like that. We don't think it's a high risk, but you might not want to. But the crucial fifth step, the one that politicians find impossible to do, is to say, and this is all provisional, we will come back to you and our advice will change as we learn more. So don't be surprised when our advice changes, because we are steadily learning. And at the beginning of COVID, I watched for that. And actually the, chief medical officer was pretty good at it. Politicians were hopeless.
And you even wrote a book about COVID and the statistical element of it.
Yeah, I wrote about with a colleague, Anthony Masters, on COVID by numbers, when we tried to just explain what was going on. I did a huge amount of media work during COVID, which I found challenging and interesting and rewarding, but sometimes frustrating, because I was always being asked, well, what should we do and who's to blame and things like that. And so that's not my job. That's not my job. I'm a simple statistician. That's all I do. I want to try to explain the numbers, which was deeply rewarding. And I still get people coming up and saying, thank you so much just for trying to help us understand what was going on. Because in COVID, we were being bombarded by numbers, false positives rates, infection fatality rates, the R number, and things like, whoa, this is really tricky. And, we wrote a column in the Observer, the Sunday newspaper, every day for a year, every week, I'm sorry, every Sunday for a year. And we still didn't run out of topics to talk about on the statistics of COVID. And people really liked it. And what they revealed to me is that there really is demand out there for somebody who has not got an agenda, who's not trying to tell them what to do or not trying to persuade them of anything, just to help people understand. It sounds very old-fashioned, but actually there is a big market out there for that.
Well, it's interesting you raised the issue of politicians, because one big news story, of course, that created months of uncertainty was, or maybe even longer, was the US election. And there was a lot of kind of too close to call punditry around the time of it. And I wonder how well you think ultimately the pollsters did perform. Could they have actually predicted the results with a greater degree of accuracy?
They didn't do very well, to be honest. Both Nate Silver and 538, I've looked back at their final projections and they were both too close to call. They actually, do the modeling, I think, in a sensible way, is that they build they use polls and lots of other information, and they build a big simulation model, and they simulate, Nate Silver simulate 80,000 possible futures, 538 simulates 1,000 possible futures, taking into account all the uncertainties, and you get this distribution. For example, 538 published theirs, distribution of the split in the electoral college, which was almost bam down the middle, with almost just pretty well half on Trump's side and half on Harris's side. Now, Trump actually had a majority of 86 in the final in the electoral college, which was in the distribution, but it was pretty way out in the tails. It's about a 20% chance of getting a difference that big. So you could say that they gave a 20% probability to what happened, or something even more extreme than what happened, which is not great, to be honest. Not great at all.
I wonder, is an admission of doubt, such as saying it's too close to call, actually a strength rather than a weakness when it comes to probability, because it indicates the limitations of predictive calculations?
Yes, but actually to say too close to call is saying you're really confident it's around 50%. Now, that's quite a strong statement. And they shouldn't have been so confident it was near 50%. Actually, they were. The problem is you're talking almost about uncertainty. You're uncertain about the probability of him winning. And that's very confusing to report. Now, on average, it was 50%, but there's actually a lot of uncertainty about it. So I didn't think they did too well. It's good. At least they're reporting a probability rather than saying who's going to win, which is nonsensical. But I think when you're reporting probabilities, what it made me realize is that they're enormously dependent on the assumptions that you're making, on the data sources that you're using. I should have looked at what the betting markets were doing beforehand, because I tend to look at the betting exchanges, which is a sort of wisdom of crowds almost, to see what was going on. And I'm not sure what they were saying as opposed to this analytic approach.
And that brings me to another important aspect of forecasting, and that's communication. And I wonder how important it is to communicate a prediction in the right way, meaning how important is the context and indicating the chances of being wrong. For example, some climate experts believe it's better not to predict.
Yeah, I do. I feel quite strongly about this, that what I put it under the label is trustworthy communication. I think expressing overconfidence or certainty about something which you're not certain about, or that you may be personally certain, but it's not reasonable to be so certain about, I think is really dangerous. And it may work to, you may be wanting to, I don't know, arouse support, to, make people, well, actually, to, sort of scare people, to get people anxious about something. But I think it can backfire, and I just don't think it's trustworthy. And there have been a number of examples in climate and other areas where exaggerated statements have been made and then have had to be retracted. And I think this does not help the trustworthiness of the science. And, it's something I feel very strongly about, that the scientists will say, oh, well, why don't people trust us? We want to be we should be trusted. Why don't people trust us? And I follow this philosopher, Honora O'Neill, who's a philosopher of Kant, duty ethics and all that stuff. Not that I've ever read a word of Kant, but never mind, I can quote 2 words. And she says very strongly that's the wrong question, is to say, how can we get people to trust us? The right question is, how can we demonstrate trustworthiness? In other words, the onus is upon us, the experts, to demonstrate it, deserve that trust. Whether this is essentially a duty ethics thing, not just a utilitarian area of trying to make people trust us. It's an absolute duty, an end in itself, to be trustworthy. I strongly believe that. And also from a utilitarian point of view, that if you're not, it's going to backfire. It will backfire.
There is in trustworthiness, of course, there's both sides, the receiver and the giver. And I wonder where gullibility fits in all of this.
Yeah, exactly. Well, you do get people who seem to believe, extraordinary things. And that's often because they feel part of a group, a sort of tribe that thinks in a certain way and reinforces each other's impressions by having, groups that communicate with each other. There's bubbles. So, I don't like sort of disparaging people as being gullible or not being very sensible, because we're all gullible to some extent, where we all believe some things that possibly many people wouldn't. But I do think that for the communicator, by being trustworthy, we found that people who are skeptical, actually, it increases their trust if you are trustworthy to them. So the very people who don't believe what you're saying will tend to believe you more if you are trustworthy. You might think, oh, they're dark, you might want to just dismiss them as being gullible people who don't believe in whatever it is. But in fact, a lot of that is because they don't trust the messenger. They don't trust the authority. They don't trust the source. And our research and others' research has shown that if that source, if the authority does communicate in a trustworthy way, in other words, not trying to persuade them, actually telling them, let's take vaccines, for example, just an example, saying that vaccines do have harms, they do have benefits, they do have harms. They're only suitable for some people in some situations, and so on. If there's some uncertainty. If they're actually honest about that and open about that, instead of just repeating the mantra, vaccines are safe and effective, then the people are most skeptical, it increases their trust. And so I don't think we should just sort of rule people out as being, being gullible. I think what we have is on onus upon the communicators to communicate in a way that does reach people who are skeptical.
But then beyond the skeptics, there's the cynics. I guess there's no winning them over.
There's some people who are just hopeless. No, they will, whatever you say, they won't believe it. There are contrarians and cynics. I follow them on social media because I want to know what they're thinking. But they're hopeless, beyond the pale. No point in talking to them.
David, can you think of any examples of real communication failures, or even perhaps communication excellence?
one of the good communication. Okay, I'm going to be boastful about this because it was one we were involved in, and it was vaccines. When it was suspected that the AstraZeneca vaccine was causing some very nasty blood clots in the brain, and our team got sent the data and were asked to do an analysis, which was going to then be presented to the public by the Deputy Chief Medical Officer in 2 days' time. And so, God, we worked hard doing the analysis and producing graphics. And we sent them in. He only got them in on the morning, and I had a telephone call with him, Jonathan Van Tam. And then he got up in the afternoon, and he was an extraordinarily trusted and trustworthy person. And he put up our graphics, and I thought, my God, these are really complicated pictures. We thought we did our best, and he's putting them up live on BBC to a huge audience. But he went through them and explained them as if the audience were an intelligent group of people. And he was just taking them into his confidence and explaining it to them. And it just showed that the benefits of vaccines, which were really big for people my age, dropped very quickly for younger people, of whom there's very little benefit. But the harms went up as you got younger. And so by the time you got into your 20s or even 30s, it was very finely balanced. And then he said, so we're not recommending this vaccine anymore for younger people, meaning under 30. And it was later increased to under 40. And everyone nodded their head and said, thank you very much. There were no accusations of U-turns. There was really good coverage. Our graphic got copied by everybody all over the media and different health services. And I'm really proud of that. It was a really hard 2 days' work. But because we tried to put into practice what we've been, whittering on about for ages, about being balanced, about not trying to deliver, not being on message. I think that one of the reasons that this worked is that we did it so late and it went in at the very last minute that government comms couldn't get hold of it. So they used our sort of academic, but I think very well designed and carefully designed by communication specialists. We've worked a lot on this. They directly used our graphics rather than government-produced graphics.
I was thinking that, the platform on which these messages are delivered are very important. And I wonder, how has this challenge of communicating possibilities been affected at a time when you have audiences that are very skeptical? There's so much trust is declining, of course. The truth is being mixed up with misinformation and disinformation. And the statistics could even be weaponized, for an agenda.
Oh, statistics are always weaponized. And I'm the most skeptical of statistics of all. When I hear a number being used in the news, my little skepticism antennae go straight up. And I think, no, what are they trying to make me think? Come on. If they're using a number, they're trying to manipulate my feelings. They're trying to frighten me or reassure me or whatever. I'm deeply skeptical of anyone who uses numbers, which is a real shame. I don't want to be cynical, but I am skeptical. And I think quite rightly, because numbers are used as a rhetorical device to try to convince people of things so often, rather than genuinely trying to inform them. And so, to repeat myself, trustworthy communication is about informing rather than persuading. And what I would love to see are numbers being used to genuinely inform people, to empower people to make better decisions. And we do need numbers. Otherwise, we're all just our gut feelings. We need magnitudes. Don't tell me that something is a risk. Oh, for goodness sakes. No. How big? Is it important? Do I care? Should I care? Is this worth doing something about? So we need magnitudes, even if only rough ones, just like when we're talking about probability. And so numbers are absolutely vital to find out whether something's worth bothering about or not. But I don't, it hurts me to see numbers being weaponized. And that does happen. It has happened in the past, and it will continue to happen. And so, again, what we need are trustworthy sources to go to get a balanced impression of what's going on. And we need to look for, I think, fairly traditional media to do that. During COVID, traditional media, their star rose because people went back to them to find out some trustworthy information. And so I think there's a really good reason to have trusted sources. I'm sure I don't have to persuade you of that.
Well, the thing is that you're a statistician and a prominent one at that. So you've got an inside track in a way. And there are a lot of people who question the times in which we live where perhaps critical thinking has gone out the window. So when it comes to numbers and statistics and everything being put out there, people tend to just swallow them.
Well, I don't think people are as gullible as made out. People are more discerning. The research suggests people are a lot more discerning that at first it might appear. And also, just because somebody forwards a social media post or something like that doesn't mean they actually totally agree with it. It's more they might think it's interesting. So, but at the same time, I'm a deep believer in supporting critical thinking. I think that it should be part of a school curriculum, deconstructing numbers, critiquing claims. It should be an integral part of the education of every citizen now and in the future. And I've been part of a group really trying to get this into the UK education system. As well, actually, what we proposed is that instead of a subject called mathematics, it's changed into mathematical and data education. And so, we've got to have good old algebra and geometry and all that stuff. I love it, absolutely love it. But we also need training in critiquing numbers, handling data, knowing about what good evidence is about a numerical claim. And these are absolutely important. I mean, it crosses, of course, the whole curriculum. It's in science and history and everything. But, it can be taught, I think, as part of the mathematical sort of structure. Absolutely vital. And I really hope we can have that happen in this country and elsewhere.
Well, David, you and I are of the same generation, basically, and the sources available to us of information were far more limited. I mean, I remember Encyclopedia Britannica. I don't know if a lot of the audience do now, but the number of sources, the number of media outlets were much more restricted, and therefore the content was much more carefully kind of gathered. Whereas now, I guess the risk is that everyone can put out something, irrespective of fact checking.
But come on. I mean, it's great. But it just meant we had no choice, essentially. You took it, you went to encyclopedia, went to a book, went to the library and flipped it, and that was it. That's all we got. Now we've got a multiplicity of sources. But the crucial thing is how to use those multiplicity of sources. And I've seen this being taught really well in Californian high schools in Silicon Valley, where they teach using the internet, using horizontal searching, not vertical searching. So in order to work out the veracity of a claim, you don't stay on that website. You cannot work out from what you're being told on a website how reliable their claims are. You have to search horizontally. In particular, you have to look what other people are saying about that website. You have to open multiple tabs. You have to look at that multiplicity of opinion and judge it. Like Obama judging all his different teams. You have to be that judge. And that's why you have to have those critical skills in order not just to take what you're being told as gospel truth, because we can't do that. I don't think we could ever do that. Considering the stuff I got taught in school about British colonial history. My God. I mean, and that was what I learned about history. Good old Robert Clive, for heaven's sake. So I got taught that, and that's all I knew about history. So now we know a lot more about history, and well, I'm glad we do. So I think this idea of horizontal searching, which is just such a fantastic technique of finding out what other people, and you've got to have an idea of what are more reliable sources. I've seen that being taught in high schools, and it was brilliant.
Well, how difficult is it to change someone's mind, though, when it comes to perception of risks? When they found a statistic in which they truly believe. I mean, you have the confirmation bias problem a lot of the time, and I guess this would draw in.
It is quite difficult to get. You have to, to change someone's worldview is quite difficult, and often what changes is personal experience of theirs. When they experience something that which has really scared them, that's going to stick with them. Or similarly, if they've actually got through something and survived it, that also might change their perspective. So I don't go into changing minds, changing behaviors. Not my job.
Fair enough, though. I did hear you talking in an interview about the foxes and the hedges when it comes to the thought process.
Oh, yeah, no. The fox and the hedgehog idea is, I think, incredibly important, because this is to do with a person's mindset. Now, whether you can change is another matter. So, basically, the old saying, Greek saying is, the fox knows many things and the hedgehog knows one big thing. And basically that's I saying that hedgehogs are people who have an ideology, a fixed way of seeing the world. Everything in the world is fitted into their preconceived notion of how the world works. Whereas foxes have no ideology. They're completely agile, they change their minds when they see new evidence. They don't follow, they're not part of any ism or anything like that. They're not a Marxist, they're not anything like that. And the point is that the research has shown that when it comes to, for example, super forecasters, who are the ones who are very good at putting probabilities on future events, they're foxes. They look at all sources of evidence. They have insight into their own thinking, their own possible confirmation biases, and fight that. And we need more people like that. I'm I'm a hedgehog trying to become a fox, I always feel, but that's I know I think I have slightly of my fixed views, but I'm hoping to become a bit more agile and flexible in my thinking. And it's tricky, but we need more hedgehogs as decision makers, as advisors, and so on, who are not committed to a single way of thinking. And we need more foxes who are like that. And unfortunately, politicians tend to be hedgehogs.
I wonder, to what degree is intuition a valid concept? Where does it fit into all of this?
Oh, I think it's very strong indeed, because, and in fact, intuition, in a sense, is Rumsfeld's missing quadrant. Because Rumsfeld talk about there are known knowns, there are known unknowns, and there are unknown unknowns. What he didn't talk about are the unknown knowns. The things we know, but we didn't realize we knew. Those good intuitions, that what's called tacit knowledge sometimes, that actually we know a lot more than we're perhaps conscious of, that we could just actually spout. We may be wrong, but I really love this idea of the unknown knowns, as you can call it intuition, you can call it something else, that we have extraordinary capacity for good, accurate insight that we have no idea where it comes from. And that's to be enormously treasured. Now, we've got to be careful with it, because it sort of bubbles up and it may not be appropriate. And I think it's good to kind of check it on other people. But as it's imagination, it's intuition, it's stuff which comes, you could call it, folk knowledge, maybe, incredibly important as a source of understanding and inspiration.
So then, David, what are some of the biggest myths, claims of probability that people assume are true, but have perhaps very little supporting evidence?
Oh yeah, well, the standard one I do when I'm doing this on show, in front of an audience, is I take a pack of cards. If I got a pack of cards and I shuffle it up, and then I say, well, to the audience, do you think that this particular hand, this particular shuffle, do you think that's happened before? And people, oh yeah, of course it does. And I say, no. I'm absolutely confident, as certain as almost as I could be of anything, that nobody in the entire history of humanity has ever had a pack of cards in this order before. And then I shuffle them again, and I say, nobody in the entire history of humanity has ever had the cards in that order before. And nobody believes me. And then I try to persuade them by pointing out that the number of possible shuffles is, well, the first card can be, the first one can be one of 52, and the second one can be one of 51, the third one can be one of 50, and you multiply all those numbers together, and you get a very big number. And I say, well, try it on your calculators, and they'll soon run off the screen, and then your phone will explode because it just can't cope with such a big number. And it's a very big number. It's it's got 67 zeros on it. Essentially, it's 10 to the 60, more than 10 to the 67. So it goes on and on and on. It's more than the number of atoms in our galaxy of the number of possible shuffles.
When you start comparing probabilities to the number of atoms in the galaxy and so on, there is one that's intriguing. I actually mention it in the intro to the show, and that is monkeys typing Shakespeare if they had typewriters.
Yeah. No, I once took part in an experiment on that. We had a computer running for about 10 days, generating random letters and spaces. And after 10 days, and just so many million attempts, it came up with 7 letters, which was fitted a quote from Love's Labour's Lost or something like that. And the point is that actually, again, it's something that with a unbelievably small probability of occurring. And actually, people have said, "Oh well, if he lasted long enough, it would occur." But actually, our whole solar system is going to be eaten up by the sun by that time. So people have recently come out with the fact that it's never, even if you set them going now, it wouldn't happen, because the most likely thing is that our entire solar system is destroyed before they actually manage to do it, even with supercomputer, however fast these monkeys were typing.
Well, different species, but it gives me a different perspective on Planet of the Apes, I guess. Now, as well as a knighthood, you share something in common with the Oscar-winning film director Peter Jackson, Sir Peter Jackson. The regiment of his grandfather, William, fought in the First World War alongside J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of Lord of the Rings, and both were injured. And those injuries possibly saved them from subsequent military action that devastated their units. So William Jackson married his nurse. And then decades later, his grandson directed the epic Lord of the Rings movie trilogy. And then your own grandfather comes into this story in some way, I gather.
Well, he does, remarkably, in sort of slightly different ways, because my grandfather missed the Battle of Passchendaele because he was ill in 1917 and sent to recuperate in Yorkshire with J.R.R. Tolkien, who was also recuperating. So they knew each other in Yorkshire. And, and my grandfather, in fact, met my grandmother there. Then my grandfather, unlike Tolkien, my grandfather did go back to the front line. He got better. But he missed the Battle of Passchendaele. But by early 1918, he was brigade gas officer on the Ypres salient around Passchendaele, which I think must have been the most dangerous job he could have had. Anyway, he lasted 3 weeks in the job, which I thought was pretty good, because he had to spend the whole time walking around between trenches, inspecting gas facilities. And the Germans would have had all the crossroads and everything sort of targeted with their artillery. And he was often, near miss, lucky to get through and so on in his diary. And then he was blown up. But the shell landed far enough away. So although he was taken back to the casualty clearing station and later declared B2, so he didn't have to go back to the front line, he survived. So he's incredibly lucky. And also, because if he had not been blown up, his battalion was then sent to the Somme, which was a quiet sector in March 1918, but then met 1 million German soldiers coming over in the spring offensive. And we've got the battalion movement orders, and we know that they did 2 counterattacks, fails, of course. And he was, by then he was a second lieutenant. He would have been first up the ladder with his little whistle, and I wouldn't be here. Absolutely no chance he would have survived that. So, by that enormous sort of stroke of fortune and everything, I am here. But of course, this holds for all of us. All of us are only here by the most bizarre circumstances. Have you thought about your conception? I mean, really, come on, have you thought about it? I have forced myself, and I found out that at the time of my conception, late November 1952, it was a really cold spell in North Devon, where they were living in this stone cottage. And it was, record-breaking, low temperatures. So, I suppose they wanted to keep warm, and here I am. But, I could so easily not have been. We're all just here by some absolutely fluke of circumstances. And thinking about this has been very humbling for me. And so, you could say it's called existential luck. The fact that just being here is an extraordinarily implausible event, you might say.
Well, David, you've used the term lucky a number of times in the story with your grandfather. And I'm wondering, are people born lucky? Can they become lucky? Can they have luck thrust upon them?
Yeah, I like luck. The born lucky is called constitutive luck. It's probably the most important one, and that's what philosophers have identified. It's who you're born as, what period of history, in what context, what country, and so on. And that is massively important. It is really changes everything in terms of your life. People underestimate it. They think that if they're successful, oh, I did it through all my own abilities and hard work and things. Well, maybe some, but a lot of it is just who you were born as. And then there's circumstantial luck, being at the right place at the right time. Someone wrote a book on luck, and he met his wife on a train and that sort of thing. Whereas my grandfather had terrible circumstantial luck, being brigade gas officer in just north of Passchendaele. And then there's outcome luck, which is just almost dumb luck. How did it work out for you at that particular time? And my grandfather had fantastic outcome luck in that the shell didn't landed far enough away. And similarly sort of survives the plane crashes of terrible circumstantial luck of being on that plane and really good outcome luck of managing to survive. I find it really useful to think in terms of these things. But of course, I don't believe that luck is some external force that operates on us. It's just chance taken personally. It's just a word we give afterwards to events that were out of our control, that were unpredictable, and yet had a big impact one way or another. I think it's really useful.
What are some of the most common miscalculations when people become excited by phrases saying something like, what are the chances of that happening, like chance meetings or similar birthdays or same birthdays and so on?
Yeah, people often ask me, I write a lot about coincidences, and they never happen to me because I'm so unobservant and never talk to anybody. So, I don't notice things. So, but people ask me, what's the chance of that happening? Sometimes you can calculate the chance, the chance of two people in a group having the same birthday. And those are, as many people know, remarkably high. If you've got 23 people together, there's a 50-50 chance that two of them will have the same birthday. So on 50% of football matches, when there's 23 people on the pitch, the two teams and the referee, you'll have two people on the pitch with the same birthday. And that's been shown to happen at work again and again and again. The one I quite like, which is, I use on groups quite a lot, is that, you've got 20 people and you say, okay, look at the last two digits of your phone number. And I win if two of you have got the same last two digits of your phone number. And I know I've got an 87% chance of winning. So nearly 7/8 of the time, I'm going to win. Out of that 20 people, two will have the same last two digits. So it's quite a good way of making money, in fact, if you start putting bets on things like that.
I seem to have, at least I feel I seem to have, a lot of coincidences. Bizarre ones, though. Meeting people literally on the other side of the world where, the factors, the same time, same place, we're both in the US at the time, based in the US, and then we meet in Shanghai or something like this. But the weird one, was the paranormalist Uri Geller. I met him as he was at CNN when I was there. We met in the lobby, and I said to him, I'm going to be back next week from the US in London. Would you like to be on my show? And I got back the next week, and my habit was to take long walks in London. Atlanta was a city where there was not many places to walk. And literally 9:00 in the evening on a warm spring night, in a very dark Leicester Square, I bumped into Uri Geller, who lives way out near Reading in Sonning-on-Thames. And I said to him, what a coincidence. And his words were, what synchronicity. Has that ever factored into your calculations?
Well, synchronicity is Jung's word for why coincidences happen. And I don't believe there's some external force that causes coincidences to happen. I just believe in that circumstance that, you're two people who may move in these particular circles, and actually your chance of meeting people somewhere else in the world is, will happen because of the circles you move in. I also think that you recognized him. You knew him. I bet there's been a huge number of times that you have been next to the same person in two different parts of the world, and you haven't realized it because you didn't recognize them. So it's not that, you're surprised that coincidence happening. There's far more happen than you're aware of. This just became manifest. There are so many, undercover coincidences that are happening all the time because of the vast number of people we come across, but that we just don't notice most of them. But you were observant. You actually noticed, whereas I wouldn't have noticed that because I'd have been walking along staring at the pavement. I could have walked past my brother and I wouldn't have noticed him. So the fact that you observed, you actually saw who it was, is deeply impressive. And that's why they never happened to me, because you actually look around you and recognize who's going past you. I'm very impressed.
No, I do actually, but that's maybe one reason. That's an interesting explanation I'll have to carry forward with me. I wonder how random are smartphone shuffles on apps like Apple Music or on Spotify when you get playlists and the same songs seem to be coming up again and again. I mean, it was supposed to be a random shuffle.
Yeah, I mean, the story is that Apple and now Spotify had to change their algorithms because to make them less random. Because if they're completely random, then even with a big playlist, you'll get repeats from the same album or even the same song very often. We know that. It's like the matching birthdays. There's so many opportunities for repeats. They'll keep on happening. People say, oh, that's not random. I only just heard that, whatever. So although I don't think they publicly admitted it, the suggestion is that both the Apple, random and certainly the Spotify random are not random. They ensure that there's no repeats too quickly. So in order to make something seem random, they made it less random. Because randomness is not even, it clusters, deeply clusters randomness. So if you throw grains of rice up in the air, let them land, they will form in really severe clusters all over the place. They won't be evenly spread over the table. They will be clustered. And that's why people say, oh, there's you do this with cancer cases. Oh, there's a cluster of cancer cases. Well, clusters happen all the time. And you need real statistical knowledge and care to identify when a cluster is really surprising and not just what you would expect by the fact that randomness clusters. Disasters come in threes. It's true.
There's obviously a lot more attention paid when money's involved, and I wonder how sports betting companies ensure that the probability of winning is greater, to benefit them rather than the pundits putting the money on the gamble.
They've had to raise their game because the algorithms for estimating odds for football matches, horse racing, and so on, about 15 years ago took a real step up, and it was statisticians who worked on those who then went off to work for the sports betting companies in order to counter. So that's what happened. My predecessor as professor of statistics in Cambridge left to join a sports betting company because he was getting so good at it. So it changed from the punters developing the algorithms, who are still trying to develop the algorithms, to the sports betting companies developing better algorithms. So there's been a battle between the algorithms. So now as a punter, I say, actually when people say, oh, I've got this algorithm to try to beat the bookies, I think we are going to find it really difficult because they're very good at it now. They're not just guessing. You're going to find the margin that you might be able to beat them by has dropped enormously. They have really caught on. So setting the odds is no longer a matter of judgment. There's some judgments can still come into it in new circumstances, but generally it is algorithmic.
This brings me back round to the subject of AI, and I wonder, do advances in artificial intelligence impact the field of probability? I mean, do they make the world a less or more predictable place?
Oh, that's tricky. I'd say less predictable on the whole, because there's a whole new force and technology out there that we just don't know what impact it's going to have. I find there's a lot of unknown unknowns, I think, about what the impact of AI might be and who will control it and so on. And we see that being discussed on a daily basis. So I think less predictable, I would say. Yeah, I mean, I find the thing I find interesting about it professionally is AI's ability to know its own uncertainty, to know what it doesn't know, and to be able to express that. And it's got better at admitting that it hallucinates about stuff, and it owns up, rather than just putting it at the bottom. It can say, well, this is an area I'm not so sure about. Be wary of hallucinations. So it's got better at putting that in its actual text. But all the time I'm looking, I would love it if it could give a measure of confidence in the statements that it's making when it's making factual claims. A lot of the time it's just I will use it for summarizing information, so bullet pointing, an argument and so on, which is different. But when it's making factual claims, I would love to know how confident it is, because I have to go and check everything it says when it's a factual claim.
Well, a final thought, David, then is there any chance of AI taking over your job as a statistician?
That's a really good question that statisticians are dealing with. Now, what I go back to is a quote from when a radiologist, reading X-rays, was asked, well, will AI replace radiologists? And he said, no, but it might replace radiologists who don't use AI. And I thought that was a really clear statement. And I think that statisticians, just like everybody else, will need to use AI. For many, I already use it for coding. Don't use it for data analysis yet, but I'm sure I will come to that. So I use it in many other areas of my work. So we've all got to use it. We've got to learn to make it part of our skill set. And if you refuse to, then I think you're going to be left behind.
Well, Professor Sir David Spiegelhalter, thank you for being so generous with your time. What a wonderful conversation.
That was great. Thank you so much for great questions. Lovely.
A fascinating chat there with Professor Sir David Spiegelhalter, probably the most highly respected statistician in his field, demonstrating to us that the only certainty is that nothing is certain. I'm Riz Khan. From me and the team, thanks for watching. We'll see you soon.